The day Elsie Shelton signed her name beside Amos Prescott's on a piece of paper that smelled like dust and ink and desperation, she told herself love had nothing to do with it, and she believed every word, right up until the moment she stopped. The year was 1873, and the Kansas prairie was not a forgiving place. It stretched out in every direction like a great tawny sea, all wind-bent grasses and enormous skies that could turn from brilliant blue to furious green in the span of an afternoon. Dodge City sat at the edge of civilization, or what passed for civilization in those years, a rough collection of saloons, mercantile stores, a livery stable, a sheriff's office that smelled permanently of tobacco, and a church whose whitewashed walls were already peeling in the relentless sun. The cattle drives had turned the town into something loud and reckless, full of cowboys who had 3 months of wages burning holes in their pockets and very little sense of restraint. It was not, by any reasonable measure, a place where a woman alone could survive for long. Elsie had turned 22 in the spring of that year, and she had been alone for 11 months. Her father, Gerald Shelton, had come west from Ohio with grand ideas about homesteading, the kind of ideas that men get when they read newspaper advertisements that promise rich soil and a fresh start. He had filed his claim under the Homestead Act, built a 2-room house of sod blocks on 320 acres of flat, unbroken land 6 miles east of Dodge, and he had worked it with the methodical stubbornness of a man who refused to admit he might be wrong. He had brought Elsie with him, his only child, after her mother had died of fever in Columbus 2 years before the move. For a while, things had been hard but possible. Then in the autumn of 1872, Gerald Shelton had been thrown from his horse while riding the fence line, and he had broken his neck on the frozen ground, and Elsie had found him just before sundown, still and cold with his eyes open to the sky he had loved so much. She had buried him herself, wrapped in the good quilt her mother had made, and she had gone inside and sat at the rough-hewn table and stared at the oil lamp for a very long time. She had 320 acres. She had 2 horses, a milk cow named Birdie, a flock of 14 chickens, and a smokehouse with enough cured pork to last through winter if she was careful. She had seeds for the spring. She had a rifle and she knew how to use it, because Gerald had been nothing if not practical about his daughter's education. What she did not have was any way to work the land alone. She was strong, stronger than most people expected when they looked at her slight frame and her careful hazel eyes. But one woman could not break sod, plant fields, tend livestock, repair fences, haul water from the creek, and hold a claim together all at once. She had tried for 2 seasons, and she had barely kept the land from slipping through her fingers. The land was the thing. The land was everything. Gerald had said so, and Elsie had come to believe it in the marrow of her bones, not as romance but as pure practical truth. That land was her future and her security, and the only thing standing between her and the kind of poverty she had watched consume other women, the kind that ended in boarding houses or worse. She would not lose it. She would find a way. The way, as presented to her by Mrs. Cordelia Fitch, who ran the only respectable boarding house in Dodge City and who had a talent for organizing other people's lives, was Amos Prescott. Elsie had ridden into town on a Wednesday in early April, her dark hair pinned severely under a worn calico bonnet, her boots muddy, her expression set with the particular determination of someone who has already decided to do something they are not entirely proud of. She had gone to see Mrs. Fitch because Mrs. Fitch knew everyone, and everyone knew that if you had a problem in Dodge City that required a solution involving another human being, Mrs. Fitch was your first call. "I need a husband," Elsie said, sitting very straight in the chair across from Mrs. Fitch's enormous oak desk, which was ludicrously grand for a boarding house office and which Mrs. Fitch clearly considered a point of personal pride. "I need someone who can work, someone who knows land and cattle and horses, someone honest. I don't need much else." Mrs. Fitch had looked at her over her spectacles for a long, measuring moment. She was a stout woman in her 50s with iron-gray hair and the eyes of someone who had heard every variety of human request and was rarely surprised. "You're talking about a practical arrangement," she said. "I am." "And you're not interested in, I'm interested in keeping my land," Elsie said clearly. "That is what I am interested in." Mrs. Fitch nodded slowly and tapped her pen against the desk. "I know a man," she said after a moment. "He came through 6 months ago looking for work and ended up staying on at the Callaway Ranch through the winter. Good worker. Callaway speaks well of him. His name is Amos Prescott. He's 26, no criminal record. I had Sheriff Beale check, because I take these things seriously. Came up from Texas, lost his family's ranch to debt 2 years back. He's been rambling since, which tells me he has no particular roots but plenty of ability. The rootless ones are often the most grateful for somewhere to belong." Elsie had considered this. "Will he agree to a practical arrangement?" "I think," said Mrs. Fitch carefully, "that Amos Prescott is a man who has been without something solid to hold onto for long enough that he will be honest with you about what he can offer, and you can decide if that's sufficient." The meeting had been arranged for the following Saturday at the Fitch boarding house parlor. Elsie had washed her hair and worn her better dress, the dark green one with the small cream buttons, because whatever this was, she intended to conduct it with dignity. She had sat in the parlor and waited, and when the door opened she had looked up and seen Amos Prescott for the first time. He was tall, considerably taller than she had expected, with wide shoulders and hands that showed every year of hard work in their callous thickness. His hair was the color of dark wheat, and his eyes, when they found hers across the room, were a clear and steady gray that reminded her somehow of the sky just before the weather changes. He was not handsome in the way that men in illustrated magazines were handsome. His face was too angular and his jaw too strong, and there was a scar along his left cheekbone that she would later learn came from a fence wire that had snapped and caught him when he was 17. But there was something in his face that she registered immediately, even then, even at the beginning when she was being so careful and so practical and so completely determined not to feel anything inconvenient. He looked like a man who meant what he said. He took off his hat when he came in. That was the first thing. "Miss Shelton," he said, and his voice was low and level and came from somewhere deep in his chest. "I was told you wanted to discuss a business proposition." She almost smiled at that because Mrs. Fitch had apparently given them both the same careful framing. "I did," she said. "Sit down, Mr. Prescott. I'll tell you what I have and what I need, and you can tell me if it suits you." He sat across from her, his hat on his knee, and he listened without interrupting while she laid it all out: the land, the acreage, the condition of the homestead, what she had managed alone, what she could not manage alone, what she expected from a husband, which was primarily work and honesty and the basic respect of not drinking away what they earned together. When she finished, there was a brief silence. "You're being very plain about it," he said. "I find that saves time," she said. He looked at her for a moment with those steady gray eyes, and then he said something she had not expected. "I'll be plain too, then. I've got nothing, no money, no land, no family ranch anymore. I've been working for other men for 2 years and I'm tired of it. I'm not tired of work, just of working for someone else's future. I know cattle, I know horses. I know how to read weather and land, and I'm not afraid of any kind of labor this country asks for. I'm honest. I've never lifted a hand to a woman and I never will. I don't drink to excess." He paused. "What I can't promise you is anything you don't want. If this is a business arrangement, I'll treat it as one. If it becomes something else, I'll be honest about that too." She had looked at him for a long time after that. "That's a fair answer," she said finally. They were married 3 days later by the pastor of the little Peeling church, with Mrs. Fitch and Sheriff Beale as witnesses. Elsie said her vows in a clear, steady voice, and Amos said his in that same deep, level way he had of speaking. And when the pastor said he could kiss his bride, Amos had looked at her first, just a brief, questioning look, and then leaned forward and pressed the lightest possible kiss to her cheek. and Elsie had felt a completely unwelcome warmth move through her at that, and had promptly filed it away in the part of her mind labeled irrelevant. They drove back to the homestead in the wagon she had borrowed from a neighbor, the Holcombs, with everything Amos owned in the world packed into one saddlebag and his horse, a big roan named Chester, tied to the wagon's back. The drive was 6 miles and mostly quiet. The prairie wind moved through the grasses in long silver waves. A meadowlark sang somewhere to the south. "It's a good stretch of land," Amos said, looking out at it. "It is," she agreed. "Your father chose well." "He thought so," she said, and something in her voice must have told him about the grief that still lived just beneath the surface of all her practicality, because he didn't push it further. He just nodded and looked at the land, and they drove the rest of the way in a silence that was not, she noticed, an uncomfortable one. The house was small and plain but solid. Gerald had built it with sod blocks in the fashion of the plains homesteaders, thick walls that held warmth in winter and cool in summer. There was a main room with the fireplace, and the table and 2 chairs, and the cast-iron stove she cooked on, and a small side room where Gerald had slept, and a loft above where Elsie had set her own bed. She had spent the 3 days between the meeting and the wedding organizing things so that Amos would have the side room and she would keep the loft, and she had done this with great efficiency, and absolutely no reflection on how strange it was that she had just married a man she had spoken to for 40 minutes. "This is yours," she said, showing him the side room, which had a narrow rope bed and a small chest of drawers and a hook on the wall for hanging things. "It's not grand. I've slept under a lot of open sky," he said. "This is fine, Miss Shelton." "Elsie," she said, because if nothing else, being called Miss Shelton by the man who was now legally her husband seemed excessive. "We might as well use first names." Something shifted in his expression, barely anything, just a slight warming around those gray eyes. "Elsie," he said, as if he was testing the weight of it. "All right." She had made supper that first evening, salt pork and beans and cornbread, which was what she had, and they had eaten at the table across from each other and talked about what needed doing. The east fence line needed repair. The south field needed breaking before the end of May. The milk cow was showing signs of an abscess in her left hoof that needed tending. The chickens needed a better pen because something, probably a coyote, had been getting in. Amos listened to all of it and asked practical questions and made notes on a small piece of paper he produced from his shirt pocket. And by the time supper was done, they had a working list for the next 2 weeks. It was very organized and very sensible, and not in the least romantic, and Elsie told herself firmly, as she climbed to her loft that evening, that this was exactly what she had wanted. She woke before dawn to the sound of him moving around downstairs, and when she came down, the fire was already built up in the stove, and a pot of coffee was on, and he was sitting at the table reading her father's almanac by the early light with an expression of serious concentration. He looked up when she came down the ladder. "Morning," he said. "I wasn't sure how early you usually started." "Early," she said. "Me too," he said, and poured her coffee without being asked, knowing somehow that she would want it, and she took the cup and held it in both hands and felt the warmth move into her palms and told herself that this was simply convenient and meant nothing whatsoever. He was out to the east fence line by full sunrise, and she could see him in the distance as she did the morning chores, a tall figure moving steadily along the fence with the methodical efficiency of a man who knew what he was doing. He fixed things properly, not quickly. She learned that about him in those first weeks. He would take longer to do a job if taking longer meant doing it right. The fence posts went in straight and deep. The chicken pen was rebuilt with such thoroughness that it would have withstood a determined assault by something significantly larger than a coyote. Bertie's hoof abscess was treated with a patience that the cow clearly found both confusing and deeply suspicious, given that she tried to kick him twice, but he spoke to her the whole time in a low, steady voice until she calmed. He could speak to animals, she realized. He had a gift for it, horses especially. Chester was devoted to him with the uncritical totality that horses reserve for the humans they have decided are trustworthy, and the neighbor's nervous mare that nobody could properly shoe allowed Amos to do it on the second attempt, which had caused old Bob Holcomb to take off his hat and stare in open admiration. Elsie watched this from a careful distance, which was how she watched everything in those first weeks. She was not cold to him. She fed him well and worked alongside him and spoke to him practically and honestly about everything that needed discussing. But she kept the distance. It was her own form of self-protection, and she was aware of it, and she told herself it was wisdom. What she had not anticipated was that Amos Prescott would not push against that distance at all. He did not pursue her. He did not try to charm her or flatter her or breach the careful separation she had established. He was simply present steadily, reliably, warmly present, in the way that a fire is present in a room, not demanding your attention but impossible to ignore. He laughed easily when something was genuinely funny. He listened when she spoke with a focused attention that she found startling, because she was not used to being listened to with that quality of concentration. He had opinions about things land and weather and horses, and the politics of the cattle trade, and the injustice of how the homestead laws were being applied, and he expressed them directly without performing them for her approval. One evening in late May, when the south field was finally broken, and they were both sitting on the front step in the cool of the evening watching the sun go down in bands of orange and deep purple, he said, almost to the air, "This is good land, Elsie. Your father had a good eye." "He loved it," she said, "more than anything." She paused, "more than was probably sensible given everything. Is that why you need to keep it?" Asked, not looking at her, his forearms resting on his knees. "Because of him," she thought about that honestly. "Partly," she said, "but also because it's the only security I have, the only thing that can't be taken away by circumstances as long as I hold the claim." He was quiet for a moment. "I understand that," he said. "I grew up on land like this, my father's place in Texas. When we lost it," he stopped. "You know, a piece of yourself goes with it, something that doesn't come back." She looked at him then, at his profile in the fading light, and saw the grief there that matched her own, and it was the first time she felt something crack, just slightly, in the careful wall she had been maintaining. "I'm sorry you lost it," she said. He turned and looked at her, and there was something in his eyes that she couldn't quite name. "I think maybe," he said slowly, "I was supposed to lose it, so I'd end up here." And then he looked back at the sunset, and the moment passed, and Elsie sat with her heart beating slightly faster than it should have been, and told herself for the last time for a while that this was a practical arrangement. The summer of 1873 was a working summer in every sense of the word. The south field went in with sorghum and a portion of corn, and Amos spent long days behind the plow while Elsie managed the kitchen garden and the livestock, and drove to town twice a week for supplies, and to sell eggs and milk at the mercantile. He came in every evening dusty and sunburned and exhausted, and she had supper ready, and they ate together and talked through the work, and slowly, so slowly that she could not have said precisely when it began. The talking stopped being only about the work. He told her about Texas, about growing up on the San Antonio plains with his father, who had been a quiet, serious man, and his mother, who had been something apparently wonderful, full of music and stories, a woman who could make a rough house feel like a home with nothing but effort and imagination. He spoke of her with a tenderness that made Elsie's throat tighten. His mother had died of cholera when he was 16, and his father had never quite recovered from it, had let the ranch slide into debt in a way that Amos, as a teenager and then a young man, could see happening but could not stop, and had finally lost the property to the bank the year Amos turned 24. His father had died 6 months later, not of any specific illness, but of the slow dissolution that grief can cause when a man doesn't have enough fight left to push back against it. "He just stopped wanting to be here," Amos said one evening, his voice quiet and level in the way it got when he was carrying something heavy. "I think he was ready to go be with my mother. I couldn't begrudge him that. I missed him anyway." Elsie had been watching him in the lamplight, and she reached across the table, without planning to, and put her hand over his. He looked down at her hand and then up at her face, and she saw something in his expression that was so unguarded and so honest that it startled her, and she pulled her hand back and looked away, and said something about checking on the chickens, and she went outside into the warm Kansas night and stood in the dark for a long time breathing carefully, because she was falling in love with Amos Prescott, and she had absolutely not given herself permission to do that. She came back inside and he was washing the supper dishes, which he had taken to doing because she cooked, and he had apparently decided without being asked that this was a fair division, and she stood in the doorway watching his broad back bent over the basin, and she felt the full weight of the situation settle on her. She had told herself she married him for the land, and that was true. It had been true. But somewhere between the fence line and the south field and the supper table, and the evenings on the step watching the sun go down over the Kansas prairie, something else had happened, and she was honest enough with herself to recognize that the something else was real and large and not going away. She said nothing about it. She was still Elsie Shelton in her own mind, careful, practical, self-sufficient Elsie Shelton, who did not allow herself to be governed by feeling. She kept her distance physically, climbed her loft ladder each night, rose before dawn each morning, and poured all the feeling into work. What she could not control was the way she had started watching him. He moved beautifully, she noticed. There was nothing showy about it. It was just the natural economy of a man who had worked with his body his whole life, who knew exactly how to place himself in relation to a task. She watched him break a young horse one afternoon in July, a bay gelding that the Holcombs had brought over, unrideable and terrified, and Amos had stood in the middle of the pen with it for 2 full hours, moving slowly and speaking quietly and reading the horse the way some men read books. And by the end of the afternoon, the horse was following him around the pen like a devoted dog, and Bob Holcomb had offered him $10, which Amos declined. "You ought to have taken it," Elsie said afterward. "Wasn't right to take it," he said simply. "Bob's struggling same as anyone. He'd have paid because he felt he had to." She looked at him. "You can't afford to be that generous." "I can afford to be decent," he said, with a quiet certainty that was not prideful, just honest, and she felt the wall crack a little more. She had begun to understand, by this point, what he had meant on the first day when he said that if this arrangement became something else, he would be honest about it. He was not pushing. He was not pressing. But he had not, she realized, been hiding anything either. He watched her, she caught it sometimes, when she turned quickly or looked up unexpectedly, with an expression that was warm and attentive and careful all at once, as if she were something precious that he was afraid of startling. And when he touched her, which happened rarely and always by some practical necessity, a hand steadied when she was climbing something, a brief contact when they were working side by side. It was always gentle and always withdrawn so quickly that she might have imagined it. She thought about this lying in her loft on hot July nights when the prairie air was thick and still, and the coyotes called somewhere in the dark distance. She thought about his gray eyes and the particular way he said her name, and the fact that he had been honest with her from the very first moment while being, she now understood, deeply kind about the limitations she had set. He had kept the arrangement she had asked for because she had asked for it, not because he wanted it. The thought of what he might want, given the freedom to want it, made her press her face into her pillow and lie very still for a long time. It was the first week of August when things shifted, because of an incident that had nothing to do with romance in the slightest, but had everything to do with who these two people were. A man named Cleet Dunbar rode onto the property on a hot Thursday afternoon when Amos was working the far end of the north field. Dunbar was a land agent, or presented himself as one, a heavy-set man in an expensive coat who represented, he said with a smooth and practiced smile, a cattle consortium out of Wichita that was buying up homestead claims in the area at above-market prices. He had his paperwork and his smooth talk, and he sat in Elsie's kitchen and poured out his offer like he was doing her a tremendous favor, and she listened to every word with her hands folded on the table and her face completely still. She knew who he was. Mrs. Fitch had told her 3 months ago that a consortium was working the area, buying claims from struggling homesteaders, some willingly, some through the kind of quiet pressure that could become not so quiet if you pushed back. She had heard that the Addison family, 10 miles north, had sold when they discovered their water source had mysteriously run dry, which happened to coincide with the consortium's men working in that area. She had heard that a widow named Margaret Pine had been visited 3 times in 2 weeks before she had given up and signed over her claim for a quarter of its value. Elsie looked at Cleet Dunbar across her kitchen table and felt an anger that was entirely cold and entirely controlled. "I'm not selling," she said. He smiled. "Mrs. Prescott, I understand sentiment, but if you consider the figure, I'm not selling," she said again in exactly the same tone. His smile held, but something changed behind his eyes. My husband is not here," she said, "and this land is in my name as well as his, and neither of us is selling. I think you should leave now, Mr. Dunbar." He left, but he left slowly, and he looked back at the house from his horse in a way that made a cold feeling settle in Elsie's chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. When Amos came in that evening and she told him, he listened without speaking until she was finished. His jaw was set in a way she had not seen before, not angry exactly, but absolutely immovable. "He won't be the last one," he said. "I know," she said. "The Holcombs had a visit last month. Bob didn't tell me until it came up in conversation. They offered twice, and then someone moved their cattle into Bob's pasture for a week, uninvited." She looked at him steadily. "What do we do?" He thought about it. "We make ourselves harder to move," he said. "We document everything, every visit, every conversation, every name. We talk to Sheriff Beale. We get our neighbors talking to each other. And we don't show them anything they can read as weakness." She nodded. "And the land? The land stays yours," he said, with a finality that was so absolute and so uncomplicated that she felt something ease in her chest. He had not said it stays ours, though legally it partly was. He had said it stays yours, because he understood, she realized. He understood what it meant to her specifically, this specific ground, this particular piece of Kansas. He had understood it from the beginning. "Amos," she said, and her voice came out softer than she intended. He looked at her. She didn't have the words for what she wanted to say, not yet. "Thank you," she said, "for understanding what it is." He held her gaze for a moment, and something moved in those gray eyes, something warm and steady and deep. "I've always understood it," he said quietly. "It was never lost on me, Elsie, what this land is for you. From the day I first saw it." He paused and then added very carefully, "From the day I first saw you, sitting in that parlor looking like you'd already decided to fight the whole world for it." She caught her breath. He dropped his eyes and stood up from the table. "I'll ride out to the Holcombs in the morning," he said in his normal voice. "We should get the neighbors organized." She sat at the table after he had gone to his room, her hands pressed flat against the wood, and her heart was doing something considerable, and she was done pretending otherwise. The organizing took 2 weeks and involved 7 neighboring homesteaders, 3 of whom Amos had to visit twice before they were willing to show their faces at a meeting, because fear was a powerful force and Cleet Dunbar had already demonstrated a talent for using it. The meeting was held at the Holcomb place, which was the largest, and Amos stood at the front of the room with a flat, steady authority that was not loud or performed but simply present, and he laid out what he knew and what they collectively knew and what he thought they should do about it. He suggested they send a formal written complaint to the Territorial Land Office in Topeka and a letter to the Dodge City newspaper. He suggested they establish a shared watch on each other's properties, not armed patrols, because that was a fast road to the kind of trouble none of them could afford, but a system of knowing where everyone was and sending word quickly if Dunbar's men showed up. Elsie watched him do this and felt a pride in him that she was by now entirely unwilling to pretend she didn't feel. He was not a man who wanted power. He was a man who stepped up when something needed doing because it needed doing, and he did it without theater. Sheriff Beale, when they called on him the following week, turned out to be a more complicated figure than expected. He was not corrupt, not exactly. But he was also not eager to make enemies of a Wichita consortium that probably had money and lawyers and political connections that extended well beyond a Kansas County sheriff's comfortable range of action. He listened to them and he made notes, and he said he would look into it, and Elsie walked out of the sheriff's office with the distinct sense that looking into it was about as far as it was going to go. "He's scared of them," she said as they walked back to the wagon. "Yes," Amos said. "So we have to be scarier," she said. He looked at her sideways and she saw the beginning of a smile at the corner of his mouth. "That letter to the newspaper," he said. "That letter to the newspaper," she agreed. The letter was written by Elsie at the kitchen table over 2 evenings, with Amos sitting across from her, occasionally suggesting a word or a fact. And it was precise and factual and documented Dunbar's methods, with the kind of specificity that is much harder to dismiss than general complaints. It named names and described what had happened to specific properties in terms of sequence and timing and the pattern of pressure. It was published in the Dodge City Times 3 weeks later, and a version of it was picked up by a paper in Wichita, and Clete Dunbar did not visit any homestead in their area for the rest of that year. They found out later, through Mrs. Fitch, who found out through channels that Mrs. Fitch never fully explained, that the consortium had decided this particular cluster of claims was more trouble than the value warranted, and had redirected their attention elsewhere. There was nothing triumphant about the way Amos received this news. He just nodded and said, "Good," and went back to what he was working on, which was a repair to the root cellar door. But that evening, when supper was done and the dishes were put away, he said, "You did that." She looked up from the mending she had in her lap. "We did that." He shook his head slightly. "You wrote every word. You had the nerve to sign your name to it when other people wouldn't." "That was you, Elsie." She looked at him, this man across the table with the lamplight warm on his face and his gray eyes steady and honest, and she set down the mending and she said, "I need to tell you something." He waited. He was good at waiting. "I told myself when I proposed this arrangement that I was being practical, and I was, but I've stopped being only practical, and I think you should know that." She held his gaze with some effort because this was one of the hardest things she had ever said. "I think I've been falling in love with you since sometime around May, and I've been very stubborn about admitting it, and I apologize for the delay." The silence lasted exactly long enough for her heart to do something uncomfortable, and then Amos Prescott stood up from his chair and crossed the small distance between them and knelt down in front of her, right there on the hard-packed dirt floor of their sod house, and took both her hands in his and said, "Elsie, I have been in love with you since I watched you sit across from me in that boarding house parlor and tell me your terms with those hazel eyes that said you would not be moved by anything less than honesty." His voice was rough with something he was barely containing. "I told myself I would give you every day you needed. I told myself I would spend whatever time it took making you glad you'd agreed to this. I wasn't going to push. I wasn't going to pressure you into something you weren't ready for." She looked at him kneeling in front of her, holding her hands, and felt the whole elaborate practical structure she had built around her heart simply dissolve in the October lamplight. "You could have told me," she said, though it came out more softly than it had any right to. "You weren't ready," he said simply. "You needed to know it was real. You needed time to trust it." He paused. "Was I wrong?" She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about everything. "No," she said. "You were right. I needed to see you first." She squeezed his hands. "I've seen you now, Amos." He rose from his knees, and she rose from her chair, and the distance between them closed in the quiet way that distance closes when two people have spent enough time being careful. And he kissed her in the lamplight with a gentleness that gave way to something much warmer. And Elsie Shelton, who had married for land and practical necessity, and the survival of everything she valued, discovered that she had also, somehow, in the random rightness of things, married the right man. The winter of 1873 was fierce. The Kansas winters did not make exceptions for anything. They arrived with a biblical seriousness and stayed until they were good and ready to leave. The Northers came screaming across the flat prairie with nothing to slow them down, driving snow horizontal and dropping temperatures to the kind of cold that killed livestock that weren't properly sheltered and people who weren't properly careful. Elsie and Amos spent the weeks before first frost in a focused flurry of preparation, banking the sod walls with extra earth, putting up additional fodder, reinforcing the barn that housed Chester and their second horse, a sturdy gray mare named Ruth, and Bertie the cow and the chickens, who had been moved to a small enclosed section of the barn once it became clear the nights were turning serious. Working side by side with him was different now. There was still the practical efficiency. They were both working people, and the work didn't stop because they were in love, but there was a warmth that ran under everything, a new ease. He touched her freely now, a hand at her back when she was carrying something heavy, fingers catching hers when they walked between buildings, and she let herself lean into it without the careful withdrawal that had governed everything before. She had not understood, until she gave herself permission to stop being guarded, how much energy guarding yourself against your own feelings actually costs. She moved her bed down from the loft to the room they now shared, which required some reorganization of the small space and a new arrangement of the chest of drawers. And this was accomplished with a great deal of efficiency and a fair amount of laughter when the chest turned out to be exactly 2 inches wider than the doorframe, and had to be dealt with by Amos temporarily removing part of the doorframe, which he then replaced with a competence that she still found mildly unreasonable. "You can do everything," she said, watching him reset the frame. "Not everything," he said without looking up from what he was doing. "I can't bake bread the way you do. Mine comes out like something you'd use to anchor a boat." She laughed, a real, full laugh that felt good in her chest, and he looked up at the sound of it and grinned, and she thought she had never seen a face look quite so right as his did in that moment. He had strong views about the winter darkness and what it should be used for. He had an old harmonica that he produced on the second evening of the first real blizzard, when they were snowed in, and the wind was doing its best impression of the end of the world against the sod walls, and he played it with a real competence that surprised her, not showy playing but warm, folk-song playing, the kind that made a small space feel inhabited. He knew old Texas songs and frontier ballads, and she knew the words to some of them from her Ohio childhood, and they sat by the fire on that blizzard evening and sang together, which was not something Elsie had done since her mother died, and which turned out to be something she needed more than she had known. She read aloud to him in the evenings, too. She had 3 books, which were considerable wealth in the terms of the plains, and he listened with the same focused attention he gave everything, occasionally asking questions that showed a turn of mind she found genuinely interesting. He had not had much formal schooling, but he had read whatever he could get his hands on throughout his life, and he thought about what he read seriously. They argued about a passage in one of the books, a collection of essays about land reform with a spirited disagreement that ended with them both half laughing and entirely pleased with themselves. And Elsie thought afterward that there was nothing in the world quite as satisfying as a good honest argument with someone intelligent who respects you enough to actually push back. She had begun to understand, that winter, what he had meant when he said he would make her glad she had agreed to this. It was not grand gestures, though he was capable of grand gestures. He had ridden through a February sleet storm to the Holcomb place when Ruth had gotten loose and wandered that direction, and had come back with the horse and a badly bruised shoulder from a fall on the ice, and had not mentioned the shoulder until the 3rd day, when she noticed he was favoring it. It was the daily constancy of him. It was the fire already built when she came downstairs. It was the coffee poured without being asked. It was the way he noticed, without being told, when she was carrying something heavier than the physical weight of it, when she was grieving her father, or worried about the finances, or simply tired in the bone-deep way that plains life produces, and simply stayed near her, without demanding she articulate it or perform recovery. He made room for her interior life, the way good land makes room for roots, deeply and without fanfare. She told him this one evening in February, stumbling through it rather inelegantly because she was not naturally given to speeches, and he listened to all of it with his elbows on the table and his chin on his hands, watching her with those clear eyes, and when she finished he said, "You do the same for me, you know." She blinked. You see me," he said quietly. "That's not a small thing, Elsie, being seen by the right person." He paused. "I've been out here a long time without anyone to see me. You look at me like I'm worth looking at." She crossed the table to him, which she was comfortable doing now, and put her hands on his face and looked at him very seriously. "You are worth looking at," she said, "considerably." He turned his face into her hands in a gesture that was so unguarded and trusting that she felt it everywhere. Spring came the way it always comes on the Kansas plains, not gently, but with a sudden desperate urgency, as if the land has been holding its breath for months and finally releases. The grasses greened almost overnight. The meadowlarks returned. The creek at the south edge of their property, which had been frozen solid for 3 months, broke up with a series of cracks and groans that sounded in the night like the earth thinking very loud thoughts, and ran clear and fast for weeks. Elsie discovered she was expecting a child in April, 2 days after the first thunderstorm of the season had rolled across the prairie with the full theatrical grandeur that Kansas spring storms specialize in. She had been fairly certain for a few weeks before she said anything, applying to this development the same careful methodology she applied to everything, which was to gather evidence before drawing conclusions. She told him on a Sunday morning, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee, in the direct manner she had of saying things. "I'm going to have a baby," she said. "In the autumn, I think. Late October." She watched him very carefully as she said it, looking for something she could not quite name, some flicker of complication or reluctance. What she saw instead was a stillness move over his face, and then something that was absolutely unmistakable. A brightness in those gray eyes that she had only seen a few times before, and he exhaled as if he had been holding his breath, and he stood up and came around the table and pulled her up into his arms and held her with a fierceness that said everything without words. "October," he said into her hair. "October," she confirmed. He pulled back and looked at her face, searching it. "How are you feeling?" "Like I need to be sick every morning and then fine for the rest of the day," she said, "which is inconvenient but manageable." He laughed a little and then he said very seriously, "I'm going to take such good care of you." "I know," she said, and she did. He took care of her the way he took care of everything, not by wrapping her in cotton wool, which she would not have tolerated, but by quietly absorbing as much of the heaviest work as he could without making it obvious he was doing so, and by making sure she had what she needed nutritionally, which involved some quite determined negotiations at the Mercantile in Dodge, and by showing up during the morning sickness with plain crackers and a complete absence of commentary that she found deeply considerate. He continued working alongside her as much as she wanted, and she wanted quite a lot. She was not going to spend 6 months sitting in a chair, but she felt him at the edge of everything, watchful and ready. The summer of 1874 was their best yet on the land. The sorghum came in full and strong, and they had planted a larger corn section than the year before, and with Amos managing the field work and Elsie managing the kitchen garden and livestock and the business side of things, the selling and accounting, which she did with a meticulous precision that meant they actually knew at any given moment exactly where they stood financially. They made enough to repair the barn roof and buy 2 additional hogs and put a small amount aside in the tin box under the floor that served as their bank. A neighbor situation arose that summer that put a different kind of strain on them. A family called the Weatherbys had moved onto a claim 3 miles east in the spring, and they were struggling in the particular way of people who had come west with too little knowledge and too much hope. Samuel Weatherby was not a cruel man, but he was a frustrated one, and frustration in men often travels in one direction. His wife, Clara, came to their door one June morning with a split lip and a careful way of moving that told a story she was not telling with words. Elsie saw it immediately. She had Clara inside and sitting at the table before the woman had finished her explanation of being in the neighborhood, which they both knew was not why she was there. Amos had seen it too. He had excused himself without being asked and gone to find something to occupy himself outside, because he understood that Clara Weatherby did not need a man in her line of sight right then, and Elsie felt such a gratitude for his instincts in that moment. She talked to Clara for a long time that morning, not pushing, not directing, just listening, which was what was needed first. Clara wept, and then was ashamed of weeping, and then wept some more. The Weatherbys had 3 children, all under 8 years old. Clara had nowhere to go. Samuel was not always this way, she said it twice, as women say it, as if the interval between violences somehow changes the nature of them. Elsie did not argue this point. She said, "What do you need right now today?" "I don't know," Clara said. "All right," Elsie said. "Then today you stay here. We have room." Amos, when she told him later, didn't hesitate for a moment. He rode to the Weatherby place himself that afternoon, not aggressively, he was careful about that, but directly. He found Samuel behind his barn, and he had a conversation with him that Elsie never heard the full content of. But Samuel Weatherby's face when Amos rode away apparently carried the expression of a man who has been made to understand something very clearly without being threatened in any way he could publicly object to. Clara and the children stayed 3 days, and when Clara went back it was after a separate conversation with Samuel in which the pastor from Dodge City, whom Amos had quietly gone to fetch, was present. The situation did not resolve perfectly. Clara went home, the children went home, and life went on in that complicated way of domestic situations where the woman has to weigh survival against everything else. But the pattern of it changed. Mrs. Fitch, when Elsie mentioned it, said she had heard from Clara Weatherby the following month that Samuel had been to see the pastor on his own initiative, which was not nothing. "You did the right thing," Amos said. "We did," she said, because he had made it possible. He looked at her across the supper table with those gray eyes and said, "You keep saying we." "Because I mean it," she said. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and they sat like that in the warm evening for a good while. The baby was born on the 22nd of October, 1874, during a cold snap that had driven the temperature down sharply and frosted the prairie grass silver. The birth was attended by Mrs. Holcomb, who had delivered enough babies to be calm about the whole enterprise, and it was long and difficult, and there were several hours in which Amos, relegated to the main room, wore a trench in the earthen floor with his pacing that took several weeks of settling to disappear. It was a boy. He was large and healthy and extremely displeased about the cold, and he announced this with a voice that carried clearly through the wall and caused Amos to stop pacing and press his hand flat against the sod wall and breathe. Elsie, when it was done and she was lying with the baby in the crook of her arm, heard the door open and looked up to find Amos in the doorway, and the expression on his face was something she knew she would carry with her for the rest of her life. A rawness and a wonder, and an absolute overflow of feeling that the angular planes of his face couldn't contain. Mrs. Holcomb, who had good instincts about when to leave a room, took herself off to the kitchen to make coffee. Amos came and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby, red-faced and dark-haired and spectacularly disgruntled, and then up at Elsie, and she saw his jaw working slightly, trying to manage something that wanted to undo him. "He's angry already," she said, because she was Elsie and practical, and also because she wanted to give him a moment. "He looks exactly right," Amos said, and his voice was thick. "He does, doesn't he?" she said, and she meant both of them. She passed the baby to him and watched Amos Prescott hold his son for the first time, watched those big, calloused, careful hands be exactly as gentle as she had always known they were capable of being. And she felt something in the room that was very much like the feeling she sometimes got on the prairie when the weather cleared after a storm, and the light came in at an angle that made everything look luminous and washed clean. They named him Gerald James Prescott. Gerald for her father, James for his. Gerald James, as a baby, had large gray eyes exactly like his father's and a temper exactly like his mother's. And Amos was besotted with him in the total, helpless way that big men sometimes fall for small children, carrying him everywhere, talking to him with the same low, steady voice he used with animals, sitting with him in the evenings with a contentment on his face that did something to Elsie's heart every single time. The years that followed built on each other the way good years do, each one adding something to the shape of a life. The land improved under their joint stewardship. Amos had a feeling for the soil that Gerald Shelton had possessed too, but in a different register. And the combination of Amos's instincts and Elsie's methodical record-keeping produced a working farm that grew steadily from surviving to functioning to genuinely thriving. They added a proper bedroom to the sod house in 1875 and replaced the sod house entirely with a wood-framed structure in 1877, which was the year they had their second child, a girl they named Ruth Adeline Ruth for the gray mare who had been with them since the beginning, and Adeline for a woman in an old Texas song that Amos played on his harmonica and which Elsie had always loved. Ruth came into the world considerably more efficiently than Gerald had, which Mrs. Holcomb said was typically how second children operated, and she had from the very start a quiet intensity that made her seem older than she was. Where Gerald was broad and warm and straightforward like his father, Ruth was sharp and watchful, and given to processing everything twice before reacting, which Amos said reminded him very much of a certain person he had sat across from in a boarding house parlor in 1873, and Elsie threw a dish towel at him for saying. The Holcomb family remained close neighbors and genuine friends throughout these years. Bob Holcomb was aging and finding the heavy work increasingly difficult, and Amos had quietly taken to helping him with the larger tasks without ever making it a transaction or a charity, just a neighbor's presence at the right times. When Bob's wife Sarah passed away from a lung ailment in the winter of 1876, it was Elsie who sat with him through the worst of it, who brought food and kept the house going for the first weeks, who understood grief of this particular kind from the inside, and could therefore be present with it without flinching. Bob Holcomb, who was not a demonstrative man, told Amos one afternoon that Elsie was the finest woman he had ever known, and Amos had agreed without any qualification whatsoever. The West was changing in those years. The cattle drives that had made Dodge City wild and loud were subject to new regulations, and the cattle baron's power was being challenged by the homesteaders and the law and the slow, grinding inevitability of fences where open range had been. The Indian nations of the southern plains had been subjected in these years to policies of brutal dispossession that the newspapers sometimes reported and more often did not, and the consequences of those policies, the confinement of peoples to reservations that could not sustain them, the destruction of ways of life that had existed for generations, were visible to anyone who was paying attention and willing to look. Amos paid attention. He had grown up in Texas close enough to the borders of the Comanche and Kiowa territories to understand that the land he and Elsie held had a longer history than any deed could contain. He said so one evening in 1876 when a newspaper article about a recent military campaign was lying on the table between them. The children were asleep. The fire was low. Outside, the autumn wind was moving through the new wood walls of the house. "We got here through a system that took it from someone else first," he said. It was not the first time he had said something like it, but he said it plainly, in the way of a man who had been thinking about it seriously. "I know," Elsie said. "I don't know what to do about that," he said. "I don't know that there is anything to do about it except know it and not pretend it isn't true." She looked at him. "And teach them," she said, meaning the children sleeping in the next room. He nodded. Teach them that land has memory and that other people's memory of it doesn't disappear because we arrived." She reached across the table and took his hand, and they sat with the weight of that together, which was perhaps all they could do, but doing it honestly seemed better than not. The third child arrived in 1879, a second boy, dark-eyed and enormous from the beginning, who they named Thomas William, Thomas being a name that had run in Amos's family, and William for William Gerald, a friend of Gerald Shelton's back in Ohio who had been kind to Elsie after her mother died. Thomas was from the start a physical child built like his father, interested in every aspect of the farm in the particular hands-on way that drove his mother to occasional exasperation and his father to poorly concealed delight. By the time Thomas was walking, he was following Amos around the farm with the focused devotion of a shadow, and Amos accommodated this by narrating everything he did. Here is how you check the depth of a post. Here is why you watch the horse's ears when the weather is changing. Here is where the water runs to when the creek floods. Gerald, the eldest, was by his teen years the one with the books. He had his mother's mind for figures and language, and Elsie had made sure that all three children had as much schooling as the plains could offer, which meant a subscription school in Dodge City that she drove them to twice a week herself through every variety of weather, because she had opinions about education that were not negotiable. Ruth was her own category, quiet and fierce, and interested in everything equally, the way some people are generalists of genuine depth. And she was 12 years old when she informed her parents that she intended to study medicine. And Elsie had looked at Amos across the table, and Amos had looked back at Elsie, and they had both said, in different ways, that they did not doubt her for a moment. There was a hard year in 1880, when a drought took most of the corn and the cattle prices fell badly, and they came closer to the edge than they had been since the first years. Amos and Elsie sat at the kitchen table that autumn and went through the finances together the way they did every month, and the numbers were not comfortable. But they had the land still paid for fully since 1878, with no debt on it, and they had the livestock and the kitchen garden and the smokehouse, and they had the reserve in the tin box that they had built in the good years specifically against the bad ones, because Elsie was the daughter of a man who had believed in preparation and had made a convert of her husband. They cut everything that could be cut without damaging the essential structure of the farm. They ate simply and were warm, and they got through it. And in the spring of 1881, when the rain came back and the corn was deep and green again by July, Elsie stood at the edge of the south field. The same south field Amos had broken with a plow in the spring of 1873, 7 years before, and felt something she could only call gratitude rise through her so strongly it made her eyes sting. Amos came up behind her and stood there, and she leaned back against him without turning around, and his arms came around her, and they looked at the field together, the green rose running into the distance, the big Kansas sky enormous and pale blue above, and the wind moving through the corn with its particular sound that is like nothing else on earth. "We've done all right," he said. "We've done better than all right," she said. He pressed his lips to her hair. "I meant to tell you something," he said, "about 9 years ago when you told me the terms of this arrangement." She smiled. "That we'd be practical." "I was thinking," he said, his voice quiet and warm, "that I had just walked into the most extraordinary luck of my life, and that I was going to do everything in my power to make you glad you'd agreed to it." She turned in his arms and looked at his face, older now than the young man from the boarding house, the lines of the years on him, the sun in his skin and the gray beginning at his temples and those same clear, steady eyes, and she felt the full weight of 8 years of a life built together, real and solid and unambiguous. "You have," she said. "You absolutely have." He kissed her there at the edge of the cornfield in the summer heat, and the meadowlark sang in the south grass, and the land stretched away in every direction exactly as it had always done, patient and enormous, and holding all the years of them without complaint. The children grew in the particular way that children on the plains grow, fast and strong, and full of the specific competencies that the environment demands. Gerald, at 12, was already helping with the books, adding columns at the kitchen table with a focused efficiency that made Amos shake his head in admiration. Ruth, at 10, had taken over most of the small livestock management, with an authority that the animals seemed to accept as simply reasonable. Thomas, at 6, was at the stage of bringing things in from outside to be examined: rocks, bones, once a very much alive small garter snake that caused a memorable supper conversation, and asking questions about all of them with an inexhaustible curiosity that kept both his parents sharp. The social world of the plains had grown as more families settled in. There were community events in Dodge City, church socials and harvest gatherings, and the occasional dance held at the larger farms in the area, and Elsie and Amos attended these with the children, and with the pleasure of people who have worked hard enough to genuinely enjoy the respite. Amos danced with a competence she had not expected when she discovered it, and she had danced with him at the Holcomb Harvest Gathering in 1881 under a sky full of early October stars, and felt the same thing she always felt in his arms, which was a rightness so complete it was almost dizzying. The Weatherby situation had resolved itself over the years in a way that was not simple but was ultimately positive. Samuel Weatherby had never been easy, but the pattern of violence had not recurred in any serious form, and Clara had found in Elsie a friendship that held up over the years. A quiet, practical friendship of the kind that forms between women on the frontier, based in shared labor and shared understanding of what the life actually costs. When Clara's youngest daughter fell seriously ill with typhoid in 1882, it was Elsie who came and stayed 4 days, and the child recovered, and Clara and Elsie sat on the Weatherby porch afterward in the amber October light and talked about everything and nothing. And it was, Elsie thought, one of the particular goods that the land had produced this friendship that had grown from a terrible morning 8 years before. In the autumn of 1882, Amos built Elsie a porch. He did it without announcement. Over the course of 3 weeks in September, while the harvest work had a natural pause, he constructed a wide front porch with a good solid rail and 2 rocking chairs that he had made himself. And he did the whole thing while she was managing the kitchen garden on the other side of the house, so that she came around the corner one afternoon and found it there, entirely finished, facing west toward the sunset. She stood and looked at it for a moment, and then she turned to find him behind her with an expression of barely concealed anticipation that she had learned over the years was his version of excitement. "It needs somewhere to put the coffee in the morning," he said. "And you have been setting the coffee down on the ground or the steps since 1873, and it bothers me considerably." She laughed that full, good laugh that had become one of the sounds of their house and went up onto the porch and sat in one of the rocking chairs and rocked once, testing it. "You made these," she said. "Guilty," he said. "Amos Prescott," she said, looking up at him. "You never stop surprising me." He came up the steps and sat in the other chair, and they rocked together on their new porch and watched the sun go down over the Kansas prairie. And it was so exactly right that there were no adequate words for it. The years continued. 1883 brought a good corn year and a new calf from one of the heifers. They had been carefully growing their small cattle herd with nothing on the scale of the great ranches, but a solid foundation that Amos managed with the same patient attention he brought to everything. In 1884, Gerald at 15 was going to the subscription school in Dodge City with a regularity and an intensity that his teacher, a serious young woman from Pennsylvania named Miss Helen Tarr, said marked him clearly for further education, and Elsie and Amos had begun to talk seriously about what that might mean and how it might be managed. The idea of Gerald going east to school was enormous and somewhat terrifying and entirely possible, and they treated it as such. Ruth, at 13, had not changed her position on medicine by 1 degree. She had, in fact, Added to it a thorough reading of every medical text that could be obtained from the Dodge City Lending Library, and a working relationship with Dr. Albright, the town physician, who had recognized in her an intelligence and a seriousness that moved him to lend her books from his own library and answer her questions without condescension, which was not universal behavior among physicians of that era when dealing with female inquirers. Amos had ridden into Dodge City one afternoon specifically to thank Dr. Albright for this, which Dr. Albright found startling and gratifying in equal measure. Thomas was 8 and had decided he intended to have the finest horse ranch in Kansas, which nobody who knew him doubted was possible. On a December evening in 1884, with the snow falling outside and the fire built high and the children all occupied in the main room, Gerald with his books, Ruth writing something she was keeping largely to herself, Thomas asleep on the rug in the way of dogs and 8-year-olds. Amos and Elsie sat at the kitchen table after supper, and Amos reached into his shirt pocket and produced a small piece of paper, folded twice, and put it on the table between them. She looked at it and then at him. "What's that?" "Open it," he said. She unfolded it. It was a receipt, a final payment receipt from the land office in Dodge City dated that month, confirming the full settlement of all claims and fees associated with the Prescott homestead, 320 acres east of Dodge City, Ford County, Kansas. She looked at it for a long time. The land, her father's land, their land, fully and unambiguously and permanently theirs. "I knew it was already paid," she said slowly. "There was a processing fee from 1873 that had been disputed in the records," he said. "An administrative thing. I sorted it out last month without telling you because I wanted to bring you the clean paper." She looked up at him. "No more open accounts," he said quietly. "Nothing pending. The land is clear and fully documented, and no one in any office anywhere has any hook into it. It's yours, Elsie. Yours and the children's after us." She felt the tears come before she could decide what she thought about them, which was unlike her, but then this was unlike most things. She blinked them back with some determination and then gave up on the determination and let one or two of them go, which Amos watched without comment and with an expression of such deep, steady love that she felt it like warmth on her face. "Papa would have liked you," she said. "He would have liked you very much." "I hope so," Amos said simply and sincerely. She folded the paper back along its crease and held it in both hands. "You said, on the day I told you this was a business arrangement, that if it became something else you'd be honest about it." "I remember," he said. "And then you told me you would spend your time making me glad I'd agreed to it." She looked at him steadily. I want you to know as clearly as I can say it, that I am glad, every single day." "That is not a polite thing to say at the end of an account. It is the truest thing I know." Amos Prescott looked at his wife across the kitchen table of the house they had built together on the land that had brought them together in the first place, and his face did the thing it did sometimes, the thing she had learned to read over 11 years, where all the containment he carried dissolved briefly, and what was underneath it was this open, honest, uncomplicated love. "Elsie," he said quietly. "Yes," she said. "I knew," he said. "From that first morning, when you came down the ladder in your practical dress, and took the coffee I'd poured and looked at the list we'd made together and just got on with it. I knew you were exactly the person I'd been looking for without knowing I was looking." She stood up from the table, folded the receipt carefully, and put it in her apron pocket over her heart, and then she went around to his side of the table and sat down on his knee like she had done on Sunday evenings for years, and he put his arms around her in the easy, encompassing way of people who have made this particular arrangement of themselves so many times it has become its own language. In the main room, Gerald turned a page. Ruth's pen moved across her paper. Thomas made a small sound and pulled himself tighter on the rug. The snow fell outside. The fire burned warm. The Kansas night was enormous and dark and fully starred where it wasn't clouded, and the prairie went on in every direction just as it always had, as it always would. In the spring of 1885, Elsie found herself expecting again, which at 34 she had half imagined was behind them. The news surprised her more than it surprised Amos, who said something about the Prescott Constitution that made her laugh for several days. The fourth child was born in October, another boy, born healthy and large in the way of his father and his brother Thomas. And they named him Gerald for the second time. No, they named him James, for the James that Gerald James had been named for, because James Prescott had been Amos's father, and they had room in the naming of children to circle back to the people who deserved to be remembered. James Prescott was, from the start, a calm and contented child who seemed constitutionally pleased with the world in a way that made Elsie wonder where exactly it had come from, since she was constitutionally practical and Amos was constitutionally serious. But there it was, this small person who appeared fundamentally optimistic, and who grew up in a house full of books and work, and a harmonica played on winter evenings, and the particular warmth of two people who had built something together from almost nothing and knew precisely what it was worth. By 1886, Gerald was 17, and the conversation about further schooling had become concrete. There was a college in Lawrence, Kansas, the University of Kansas, founded in 1866, and Gerald's teacher, Miss Tarr, had written a letter of recommendation of such warmth and specificity that the response from Lawrence had been both enthusiastic and accompanied by information about a scholarship available to promising students from the western counties. Amos and Elsie sat down with Gerald at the kitchen table and laid out what they could contribute financially and what the scholarship would cover and what Gerald would need to manage on his own. And Gerald, who had his mother's eyes for numbers, worked through it himself and said he thought it was manageable. The conversation about what it meant, Gerald leaving the farm without him, the future he might have, was harder, and they had it in the evenings after the younger children were asleep, just the three of them, and Elsie watched her son in the lamplight and saw in him everything she and Amos had tried to put there, and a great deal of what had simply arrived already assembled in his nature, and she thought, this is what it is for. Not just the land, all of it. This is what the whole thing has been for. On the morning Gerald left for Lawrence in the autumn of 1887, packed into the wagon for the trip to the train station in Dodge City, Thomas stood very straight and did not cry, which he had been practicing for a week, and Ruth hugged her brother with a ferocity that spoke volumes, and James, at almost 2, was largely unaware of the drama but sensed the mood and attached himself to Gerald's leg until Amos gently detached him. Elsie kissed her son and told him things she had been saving up, and he looked at her with those gray Prescott eyes and said, "Mama, you and Papa built everything. I'm just going further with it." She let go of him with the full and deliberate grace of a woman who understands that this is how it is supposed to go. On the drive home from the station, Amos had her hand in his on the wagon seat, and they drove in the particular silence of people who have just watched something enormous and good begin, and the prairie was golden in the October light, all the grasses turned amber and rust, and the cottonwoods along the creek showing yellow. "He'll be fine," Amos said. "I know," she said. "He has your head," he said, "and enough of my stubbornness to use it." She squeezed his hand. "Our stubbornness," she said. He looked at her, and she saw the smile start in his eyes before it reached his mouth. "Our stubbornness," he agreed. Ruth's path toward medicine continued through those years with an implacable certainty that Elsie recognized as something she had passed on directly. Dr. Albright, who had become a real friend to the family in the way that small community doctors sometimes do, said by 1888 that he had taught her everything he could with what he had available, and that if she intended to pursue formal medical training, she should look at the Woman's Medical College of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, which had been training women physicians since 1850. The idea of Ruth in Philadelphia was staggering and also, Elsie thought, completely inevitable. She was 17 and certain, and nobody who had ever met Ruth Prescott would have bet against her. The financial logistics of this were substantial. They worked through it carefully, the way they worked through everything, the land's income, what Gerald was managing in Lawrence, what Ruth would need, what they had in reserve, what could be sold and what could not. Amos proposed a solution that Elsie initially objected to on principle, which was to sell 10 acres of the east boundary, not prime land, a strip that was low and prone to flooding, to Bob Holcomb's son, who had taken over the Holcomb place and who had offered for it twice before. The price was fair. It was still their land, essentially. The son, young William Holcomb, had grown up beside them and was a good neighbor. And with what it raised, added to what they had in the tin box, now kept in a proper strongbox bolted to the floor, because Amos had built that into the house when they built it in 1877, Ruth's first 2 years could be funded without debt. "It's 10 acres, Amos said. "I know," Elsie said. "The land is still the land," he said. 310 acres is still this. It's still yours. It's still what your father built." She looked at him and felt the care in him, the way he understood that this was not just financial arithmetic, the way he had always understood it. "He would say the same," she said, meaning her father. "He would say use what you have to give your children what they need to go further." "He would," Amos said. "You are his daughter down to the bone." She signed the sale papers with a clear hand and no hesitation, and she told Ruth that evening, and Ruth had said, "I'll come back, you know, when I'm a physician. I'll come back here." And she had meant it with the total certainty she brought to everything. The house in 1889 was a living, full place. Thomas was 13 and had begun the genuine horse work in earnest, had a colt of his own that he had been training since it was born, and Amos had been teaching him everything he knew with the same patient narration he had applied since Thomas was 4. James was 4 now and inseparable from Thomas in the way of small boys and the older brothers they worship. And Thomas bore this devotion with a generosity that said something good about who he was becoming. Letters arrived from Gerald in Lawrence with the frequency that a son who writes well and has a great deal to tell his parents can manage. He was thriving. He was studying law, which surprised nobody who had watched him argue about land reform at the age of 10. He had made friends, described them in his letters with the characteristic precision. This one good but impatient, this one kind but sometimes silly, this one the finest person, and I think he will be important someday, which Amos had read aloud, and then said that Gerald sounded like his mother evaluating prospects, which had made Elsie considerably more amused than she let on. Letters arrived from Ruth less frequently, but with greater density, pages of observations about everything she was learning, about the faculty at the college, about Philadelphia, which was so different from the Kansas plains that it might as well have been another country. She was doing well. She was doing extraordinarily well. She said in one letter that she thought she understood for the first time why Amos had told her since she was small that the land had memory, because Philadelphia had a different kind of memory, layered and dense, and different from the open plains but equally real, and she was learning to read it. Elsie had read that letter 3 times. In the spring of 1890, Amos turned 43, and they had been married 17 years, and Elsie stood on the porch he had built her in 1882 with her morning coffee, always on the porch now, every morning, and looked out at the land in the early light. The prairie was greening. The meadowlark was back. Chester had died the previous winter at the age of 22, which was a genuine grief for the whole family, and for Amos in particular, who had sat with the old horse at the end, with the same quiet presence he brought to all goodbyes. But the herd of horses Thomas was building was young and strong, and the farm was sound, and the family was spread out in the wide way that good families spread, 2 here, 2 in the world, all of them part of the same rooted thing. Amos came out and stood beside her with his own coffee, and they looked at the morning together in the comfortable silence of almost 2 decades. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Everything at once," she said. "You." "I was thinking about that Wednesday in April in 1873, he said, "when I rode out here for the first time." She looked at him, And what were you thinking about it? I was thinking, he said, that I had no idea, coming over that rise and seeing this place for the first time, that I was riding into the rest of my life. He paused. In the best possible way. She leaned into him, and his arm came around her shoulders, and they stood on the porch in the April morning, and the land went on before them. 310 acres of Kansas, earned and kept and worked and loved, home to the years of them, the children of them, the full account of two people who had made a practical arrangement that had become the greatest thing in either of their lives. I thought I was marrying you for this land, she said. I know, he said, and his voice was warm. I was wrong about what I was marrying you for, she said. He pressed his lips to her temple. You were not wrong, he said. You were just getting the full picture in stages, which is pretty much how everything good arrives. She laughed softly, and the morning light spread across the Kansas prairie, and the meadowlark sang its clear, ascending song into the enormous sky, and the wind moved through the grasses in the long silver waves that had been moving there long before either of them had arrived, and would be moving there long after, carrying with them the memory of everything that had been built and grown and loved on this particular piece of ground, in this particular life, by these two particular people who had found each other. Impossibly and perfectly, in the practical circumstances of an 1873 April morning that had turned out to be, from the very first word, the beginning of something extraordinary. The years after that continued to bring their gifts and their demands in the balanced way that life in that country always had. In 1891, Gerald completed his law studies in Lawrence and returned to Kansas, not to the farm, but to Dodge City, where he set up a small practice with the focused intention of working on land rights and homesteader disputes, which was, as Elsie said when she heard this, exactly what his grandfather would have wanted him to do with a legal education. He brought home a young woman to meet them that Christmas, a woman from Lawrence named Catherine Hayes, who was warm and direct and laughed easily, and looked at Gerald with a steady fondness that Elsie approved of on the spot. Amos asked Catherine 3 practical questions about her family and her views, and then shook her hand and said she was welcome, which was his highest form of social endorsement. Gerald and Catherine were married the following spring in a ceremony in Dodge City that brought together everyone who mattered: the Holcombs, Mrs. Fitch, now in her 70s but still managing everything from her oak desk, Dr. Albright, Clara Weatherby and her family. Amos stood at Gerald's shoulder as he said his vows, and when Elsie looked at the two of them side by side, her husband and her son, the gray eyes identical, the set of the shoulders the same, she felt such a layered, complex happiness that she had to look away for a moment. Ruth came home from Philadelphia that summer, 3 years into her program, for a visit of 2 weeks. She was 20 years old and had grown into herself in the way that Philadelphia and medicine and her own immovable nature had made possible, and she came off the train in Dodge City in a plain dark dress with a traveling bag, and the expression of a woman who has been away long enough to understand what she values about where she came from. Amos hugged her for a long time, and she let him, which was notable because Ruth was not generally effusive about physical affection. James, who was now 6 and did not remember her clearly, studied her with large eyes and then announced that she was the smartest person he had ever seen, which made everyone laugh, including Ruth. She walked every acre of the farm in the 2 weeks she was home, with her hands in her pockets and her eyes moving over everything. She sat on the porch in the evenings with Elsie and asked questions about the neighbors and the town and the political situation of the territory. Kansas had been a state since 1861, and she talked about Philadelphia and medicine and what she intended to do with it. She was going to complete her degree, she said, which was 2 more years, and then she was going to come back to Kansas and practice medicine where it was needed, which was everywhere west of the Missouri River. There's almost nothing out here, she said, in terms of real medical care. Doctor Albright is one man covering 100 miles. Women on the frontier are having babies with nobody who knows what they're doing. Children are dying of things that shouldn't kill anyone. I could be part of fixing that. Amos looked at his daughter across the supper table. You will be, he said. The certainty in his voice made Ruth look at him for a moment with a directness that was very like her mother's. You always believed that, she said, both of you, before I had any evidence to show you. You didn't need to show us evidence, Elsie said simply. You showed us yourself. Ruth went back to Philadelphia in August, and the house was quieter after she left in the particular way it always was after she had been in it, because Ruth had an energy that occupied space meaningfully. Thomas, now 15, said that when he had his horse ranch, he was going to need Ruth to be his farm physician, and when they pointed out that physicians did not generally service horses, he said that Ruth would be the exception to every rule, and nobody argued with that. The decade turned. 1893 brought a depression that reached even into the Kansas plains. The financial panic that hit the country that year was real and serious, and affected farm prices and credit, and the general economic health of every small operation in the territory. They tightened again, as they had in 1880, with the same methodical efficiency, reducing costs where possible, maintaining essentials, keeping the livestock healthy because the livestock were the foundation. Gerald, in his Dodge City law office, handled a considerable number of cases that year for homesteaders facing foreclosure, many of them without fee, because he was his mother's son and his father's son, and had opinions about what a legal education was for. In 1895, Ruth Prescott returned to Kansas. She had her degree from the Woman's Medical College of Pennsylvania. She had done 2 years of additional study under a physician in Boston who specialized in obstetrics. She was 23 years old, and she came home to Dodge City and rented a small office on the main street and put up her sign, Dr. Ruth Prescott, physician, and the town of Dodge City, which had seen a great many things in its history, had not previously seen this particular thing and was collectively uncertain how to respond. The uncertainty resolved itself inside of 6 months, because Ruth was who she was and because the need was what it was, and by the end of her first year in Dodge City, she had delivered 14 babies and treated more cases of fever and infection and injury than she could easily count, and there was not a family in the area that did not know her name. Dr. Albright, who was now in his late 60s and thinking about retirement, said publicly on several occasions that he was grateful to see the future of medicine in Ford County standing 5 feet 4 inches tall in a dark dress with a medical bag. Elsie went to see Ruth's office in the first week she was open, and she sat across from her daughter at the desk, a plain oak desk, practical and unadorned, and looked at her with everything she felt, which was enormous. "I am so proud of you," she said. "I want to say it plainly, because I don't always say things like that as plainly as I should." Ruth looked at her mother, and her composed face did something soft. "You raised me to do exactly this," she said. "You and Papa both. We gave you soil," Elsie said. "You did the growing." Ruth reached across the desk and put her hand over her mother's, and they sat like that for a moment, 2 Prescott women, Shelton-born and prairie made, in the quiet of a doctor's office in Dodge City, Kansas, in the autumn of 1895, and the feeling in the room was one of the best feelings that either of them had ever been in the presence of. Thomas, at 19, had begun his horse ranch in earnest. He had 12 horses by 1895, all of them trained with the same patience and attentiveness he had learned from his father, and he had begun selling trained horses to ranches throughout the county at prices that reflected their value accurately, which was something ranchers initially pushed back on, and then came to respect, because the horses were genuinely excellent. He was doing what he had said he would do, with the same uncomplicated certainty that had characterized him since he was 8 years old, telling people he intended to have the finest horse ranch in Kansas. James, at 10, was the reader of the family in a way that even exceeded Gerald at the same age, and Elsie taught him herself for the most part because what was available in the local school no longer satisfied what he needed, and she did it with a pleasure that was entirely genuine, because Teaching James was like thinking alongside someone who was simultaneously discovering everything for the first time and had somehow already been thinking about it. In the evenings of those mid-1890s years, with Thomas and James at home, and Gerald in his law office, and Ruth in her doctor's office, and the farm running with the established ease of more than 20 years, Elsie and Amos sat on their front porch in the rocking chairs he had built and watched the Kansas evening come in and talked about their lives with the freedom of people who have said all the difficult things years ago and are now in the territory of comfortable honesty. He still played his harmonica on cold evenings. She still read aloud when they had a new book. She still set the coffee on the porch rail exactly as he had predicted she would, and he had built the porch exactly wide and sturdy enough for it, which was not an accident. One September evening in 1896, sitting on the porch with the first real cool of autumn in the air and the sky going from amber to deep rose to indigo above the prairie, Amos turned to her and said, "I have been thinking about something." She looked at him. "Tell me." "I would like," he said carefully, "to take you somewhere. Before we're too old and too sensible to go." She raised an eyebrow. "Where?" "Texas," he said. "San Antonio, the land my family came from. I'd like to see it once more, and I'd like you to see it with me." She looked at him for a long moment. He had spoken about Texas over the years as one speaks about something that belongs to the past with some care, as if approaching a place that holds pain. He had never in 23 years suggested going back. "Are you ready to go back?" she asked. "I think I am," he said. "I think with you I am." He paused. "I'd like to show you where I came from, the way you've shown me where you came from by bringing me here." She reached out and took his hand. "Then we'll go," she said. They went in the spring of 1897, traveling by train from Dodge City to San Antonio, which was a journey of considerable duration and no small expense that they had decided was justified. Thomas managed the farm in their absence. At 21, he was more than capable of it, and Ruth and Gerald were near enough to the family for anything urgent. They took 2 weeks. Texas in the spring was something Elsie had not adequately prepared herself for. The hill country south of San Antonio had its own beauty, different entirely from the Kansas plains, but carrying a similar quality of openness, live oaks and limestone, and the clear rivers running through it. The wildflowers on every hillside in April, the sky as large as any sky anywhere. Amos showed her the country of his childhood with a quiet intensity that told her what this cost him and what it gave him, and she stayed close to him the whole time and watched him let something that had been held a long time slowly release. He found the land where his family's ranch had been. A different family owned it now, had for 15 years. The house had been rebuilt, but the barn was the same structure, and he stood at the fence and looked at it for a long time without speaking, and she stood beside him with her hand in his. "It looks smaller," he said finally. "It always does," she said. He looked at her. "How do you know?" "Because you've spent 24 years building something bigger," she said. "It gets smaller by comparison." He was quiet for another moment, and then he exhaled deeply, and she felt something shift in him, not a loss but a release, the final letting go of a grief he had carried with more grace than it deserved. "Let's go back," he said. "Back to the hotel?" she asked. "Back to Kansas," he said. "Back home?" She smiled at the word. "Not until we've had the supper Mrs. Morales recommended at the hotel," she said. "You said yourself the enchiladas were remarkable." He looked at her with those gray eyes that she had been reading for 24 years and knew as well as she knew the land, and he laughed the full, warm, real laugh that she loved most in the world, and he pulled her into his side and said, "You are completely right, as you generally are, and I love you unreasonably." "Only unreasonably," she said. "Entirely unreasonably," he said, "with every part of whatever I am." They had the enchiladas, which were in fact remarkable, and they went back to Kansas, and they came home to the farm at sunset on a May evening, pulling into the yard in the wagon Thomas had sent to meet the train, and the prairie was golden and enormous in the evening light, and the house sat solid and right in the middle of it, the porch warm in the sun, The lamp already lit in the window, and Elsie Prescott looked at all of it, at her home, at the land, at the man beside her, and felt the completeness of it settle over her like something permanent. Thomas had made supper. James had set the table. Ruth came in from Dodge City later that evening, having heard they were back, and they sat around the table, all five of them, Elsie and Amos and the three children who were home. And the conversation was loud and overlapping and full of laughter, and James asking 17 questions about Texas, and Thomas asking about the horses he had seen, and Ruth asking about the medical situation in San Antonio with professional interest. And Amos answered everything with a patience and a pleasure that was so openly happy that Elsie, watching him across the table, felt her eyes sting for the second time in 24 years. After supper, after the children had gone to their respective spaces, Thomas to the barn for a last check on his horses, James to his books, Ruth to the guest room she kept at the farmhouse, Elsie and Amos sat on the front porch in the dark, rocking slowly with the enormous Kansas night above them and the crickets enormous in the grass and the stars uncountable. "Thank you for going with me," he said. "Thank you for asking me," she said. A silence. A good silence. "Elsie," he said. She said. "I want you to know something," he said, and his voice was the way it got when he was going to say something real. "This life, this exact life. There is no version of any other life I could have imagined that would have been worth the trade." She stopped rocking. She looked at him in the darkness, his profile familiar and beloved, the gray of his hair silver in the starlight. "Not even close," he said. She reached across the space between their chairs and found his hand in the dark, and he laced his fingers through hers, and they sat there on the porch of the house they had built on the land that had brought them together, in the vast and beautiful dark of the Kansas plains, and everything that had ever been between them. The practical arrangement and the careful distance and the slow falling, and the years of work and the children, and the neighbors and the grief, and the good harvests and the hard winters, and the porch built in September, and the harmonica on winter evenings, and the cornfield at sunset, and the meadowlark every spring, all of it was present in that handhold, right therein. The night, she had told people when asked that she had married him for the land. It was true, the way a seed is true before it grows into the thing it actually becomes. The land had been the door, and through it had walked everything. What it had grown into was this. What it had grown into was everything. The stars moved their slow circuit above the Kansas plains, and the wind moved through the grasses, and Elsie Shelton Prescott and Amos Prescott sat together in the evening of a life built well. And it was whole, and it was theirs, and it was enough, and it was more than enough. And in the spring, when the meadowlark came back and the prairie greened again, and the children moved through the world with everything their parents had tried to give them, the land would receive another year of planting and would give back another year of harvest, as it always had, as it always would, holding beneath its surface the unwritten record of everything that had grown from a Wednesday in April 1873, when a practical woman and a steady man had sat across from each other in a boarding house parlor and been, without knowing it yet, entirely right for each other.